Human beings are creatures of habit, some more so than others. I would know, as my entire life consists of lists of carefully regimented actions to make it from day to day. Hooray for the 2020s! Sure, you have some people who are spontaneous and randomly decide to go skydiving, but even they have a certain set of routines that they adhere to. The same is true with gaming, and it's how advertising works too. You provide the player with an experience that's similar to something they had previously enjoyed, while altering it either in beneficial ways or just enough to differentiate itself from its influences. There are entire algorithms on the internet now dedicated to finding those games. Do you like Knights of the Old Republic? You might enjoy Mass Effect. The conventional wisdom states that people need to change things up every so often to avoid stagnation. But this philosophy doesn't seem to work for a large subsection of the gaming populace, who are happy to play the same genre, or even the same game, indefinitely for the rest of time. I'm one of those other people who has played every genre from puzzler to roguelike to simulation and everything in between, and to anyone who has watched the Random DOS game show, it's clear that even I have my favourites. Despite this, there are still titles from genres I wouldn't particularly enjoy that surprise me by overriding my dislike of said genre by just being so undeniably good. The problem with these titles, and with a lot of games in the past, is that they require an extensive amount of considered thought in order to really get into them, either due to a high skill ceiling or a lot of complex systems or keyboard commands, something that the console games never suffered from, having one controller to do everything. It was commonplace to read a manual before playing a game in order to familiarise yourself with its workings, usually while the game was installing, which could take a significant amount of time itself. For a lot of people in the 2020s, if they've had a long hard day, they don't want to tax their brain, they want to vegetate in a comfy spot and turn it off altogether. It's why TV, and now streaming, is so huge. But it's not the only reason that people are abandoning the systems of old and embracing this new style of immediacy. The constant bombardment of instant gratification in the form of dopamine hits from society has found its way into the gaming landscape, just like it has with every other facet of entertainment. Whether it's instant respawns or quick saving or the ability to undo a move, gaming has adopted the same constant and frenetic pace as the rest of modernity, jumping you from one moment of progression to the next, much like how a casino does, or a bad sitcom from one laugh track to the next. There's no space to breathe or ruminate on what you've just experienced. And when playing a game, there is a cost to all this, and players will feel it for not having truly challenged themselves, even in the multiplayer arena, by constantly repeating the same moves to activate the same pleasure centers in perpetuity. There's a point where it becomes an autonomous motion. In sport, the idea of autonomous motion is an action taken by the sportsperson that is purely reactive. It's an immediate muscle memory movement that requires no thought on their part. Apply this to gaming and you're not really using your brain anywhere near as much as with the older titles. Now, not all modern titles are glorified slot machines, with some priding themselves on their borderline masochistic difficulty levels, but even a large chunk of those adhere to the design philosophy of their more immediate counterparts, with hand-holding tutorials and save scumming and the ability to cater the game's difficulty to your liking. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as the more customizable a game is, the better. But by leading the player by the nose through every system and mechanic instead of letting them discover it, or read about it before attempting it unassisted by the game, is kind of demeaning. Instead of exploring options and learning through trial and error, everything is placed front and center and spoon-fed to the user. And quite frankly, it's because the player base has changed since the 80s and 90s, and many of them need that spoon-feeding. Having said that, there are plenty of games back in the day that didn't require a PhD in order to understand. Anyone could pick up and play the likes of Tetris or Lemmings or Puzzle Bobble. If you wanted games with simple controls and on-screen prompts or a gentle difficulty curve back in the day, there still were plenty of them around. I played one recently that was controlled by the 2 shift keys and nothing else. But you also had games that held a mystique to them, with large manuals and vast impenetrable worlds that required players to learn and grow, and use their minds to overcome the obstacles the game chucked at them. Privateer's Hold is a good example of this. The first dungeon level of Daggerfall and a huge and unforgiving place to start your adventure. Ironically, this was a game that did have a brief tutorial in the form of pop-up messages. But if you were spec'd wrong or didn't know what you were doing, you would get lost and die, even with that to help you. Should you make it out of that, a vast world sprawls out before you. And if you pick the wrong place to go, you die. The same could be said of its sequel Morrowind. You didn't start in a dungeon this time, but you had less stats to worry about. And if you ventured too far outside the opening village, monsters would descend upon you and happily tear you to pieces because there was no level scaling. These early teething parts of the game made the latter sections all the more memorable, because by utilising knowledge that was hard fought for or researched independently, the player gained a greater sense of satisfaction. Delayed gratification that felt all the more sweeter for having used their mind in order to get there. And rather than the immediacy of not being in the place they were, their engagement with the title meant that everything else went by the wayside too. Both are forms of escapism from outside influences and obligations, but only one is really beneficial in the long term. A good example of this is a simple question. Would someone whose brain has been hardwired to immediately accept gratification be able to appreciate the slow burn of learning that many of these older games required? Spoiler alert, the answer is usually no. And that also applies to older people who have played the game in the past. We're not immune to the effects of endless scrolling on the internet or quick-fix solutions to problems. Our attention spans will diminish too if we're not careful, even if they're not being attacked in our formative years when our minds are most receptive. It's why many people have abandoned gaming entirely. Rather than playing a title and experiencing it for themselves, they watch others play and gain gratification through the socialization aspect and passively consuming a title that was meant to require active engagement. And now that people have forgotten how to delay that dopamine and need everything here and now, they're stuck between sending the same sensations through burnt out synapses and wondering why the pleasure centers aren't activating, and trying to relive past glories only to discover that their brain zones out before it gets to the payoff. Many people who don't play computer games erroneously equate it with television, because both involve staring at the screen for extended periods of time. But time and time again, studies have shown that actively engaging in media, rather than passively consuming it, can be beneficial to the brain. Games that reward long-term planning over short-term benefits are reprogramming your frazzled mind to accept using your skills to maximize a reward later by encouraging inventiveness, perseverance without grinding, and cunning. They throw you into scenarios that require considered application of those skills, and the more you use your brain in those scenarios, the better it becomes at dealing with them, opening you up to a world of other games you previously didn't have the patience to play, while still allowing you to play everything more immediate should you feel like doing that instead. There's no right way to play a game, and there's a time and a place for every type of game. But often it's far easier to just play the simple game that will reward you quickly, or the familiar game that you know the ins and outs of, than the game that will take some getting used to, but will eventually give your brain something new to toy with, and a much better payoff. Don't sacrifice entire decades or genres or styles of play because you can't get over the mental hump of getting into them. You're doing your own brain a disservice by failing to discover what's out there. And this doesn't just apply to future generations. I know many retro gamers have got a list of classics they enjoy and the rest can just go jump in a fire for all they care. But there's a great game they've never played that they just need to get round to trying. There's probably one for you too if you look hard enough. Do your brain a favour and let it experience something new, even if that something new is something old. And if you like me rambling on about this, I have a whole channel of retro stuff for you to look at. You can check out my scripted videos playlist, or just go visit the channel, see if you like it. Until next time.